In the summer of 1943, as the Kyofu floatplane was just entering active service, Allied air power was a different animal entirely from what it had been in 1941. Now this Japanese fighter would have to go up against the best carrier fighters the United States Navy had. It would also have to face the newest Allied land-based aircraft, which were already flying out of forward strips the Allies had taken. No floatplane was going to compete with that, no matter how good it was. That should have been the end of the line for the N1K1. It wasn't. Later in the war, American pilots ran into a land-based version of the radically redesigned Kyofu, and what they found was a far more serious airplane. They gave it the reporting name George. The idea of rebuilding the floatplane as a land fighter had come from Kawanishi's chief engineer, Shizuo Kikuhara, just a couple of weeks before the outbreak of the Pacific War. The numbers he put in front of Kawanishi's management were good enough that the company took the idea seriously. However, with the country weeks away from war, leadership decided not to stick its neck out. So the whole thing went ahead as a private venture with no Navy contract and no announcement. That turned out to be the right call. At first, the Navy wanted nothing to do with the new aircraft, simply because it was a private venture rather than an officially commissioned project. Then the war started going badly for Japan, and the Navy's position changed. Its own official interceptor, the J-2M Raiden, was barely trickling off the production line. Meanwhile, the I-6M0 was being outclassed by a whole new generation of American naval fighters arriving in the Pacific in numbers. What the Navy needed, and needed quickly, was a far more powerful land-based interceptor and air superiority fighter. Kawanishi's new aircraft could fill that gap. A fighter developed with no Imperial Navy backing at all and entirely outside its official doctrine was about to become the Navy's best hope. The new land-based fighter was led by the engineer Yoshio Hashiuchi, and in-house it carried Kawanishi's own designation, the X-1. At its core, it was still the Kyofu, but it was fitted with a much more powerful Homar engine and a huge 4-blade propeller, just under 11 feet across. That prop, together with the mid-wing layout, meant the aircraft needed exceptionally long landing gear to keep the blades clear of the ground. On the first version of the fighter, officially named the Shiden, those long gear legs were the airplane's biggest weakness, and they never really got fixed. The way around the problem of stowing them was a clever telescoping strut that shortened itself as it came up. Mechanically it worked, and it was also exactly what caused all the trouble later. On the climb out, the strut telescoped down inside itself so that it would fit into the wheel well. The X-1 prototype made its first flight on December 27, 1942. Almost immediately, the engineering team ran into serious trouble. First, the brand new Homar engine was nowhere near sorted out. It simply failed to deliver its promised horsepower. On top of that, the overly long main landing gear struts lacked structural strength. The legs were not strong enough for the weight coming down on them. Initial testing also revealed that the rudder gave the pilot almost nothing while he was taxiing, which left keeping the aircraft straight on the ground to the brakes, and the brakes barely worked. It also had some genuine strengths. Visibility from the cockpit was superb, in the air and on the ground, which for a tail dragger with that much nose in front of the pilot was not a given. It climbed hard, it was fast, and it turned better than anything the Navy had flown with that much horsepower in it. In a dive, it was in a class of its own. It would outdive both the Army's Ki-43 and the Navy's A-6M, neither of which you wanted to push. Despite the teething troubles, the X-1 prototype did well enough that Kawanishi laid down 3 more, and all 3 were ready to fly in July 1943. The company then took a gamble and handed one of them over to the Imperial Navy for official evaluation. Naval aviation leadership didn't trust the Kawanishi fighter from day one. This was mainly because the airplane had been developed as a private venture rather than under a government contract. So the officials went looking for problems, and they found plenty of them. Anything that deviated even slightly from the Naval Aviation Bureau's strict new requirements got picked over, and the fact that the fighter flew well didn't count for much in that room. Their assessment was that the X-1 prototype offered nothing. The Navy's own project, the Mitsubishi J-2M2 Raiden, didn't already have. Eventually, and very grudgingly, the Navy agreed to put its best engineers and technicians on the aircraft. Their job was to help Kawanishi get the thing working. The interceptor was later designated the N1K2-J Shiden. Work started right away. Kawanishi began cutting production tooling at its Naruo plant, and a second assembly line was planned for the company's other factory at Himeji. The first aircraft off the line were fitted with the Nakajima Homare, rated at 1,820 horsepower for takeoff. The engine had a 2-speed supercharger, which gave it 2 rated altitudes. In low blower, it made 1,600 horsepower at about 6,500 feet. In high blower, it held 1,440 horsepower up around 19,000. 4 more prototypes, built alongside the initial production run, received an upgraded version of the Homare. Engineers reworked the cylinder cooling and made several other technical refinements, and takeoff power went up to 1,990 horsepower. At around 5,700 feet, the engine delivered 1,825 horsepower, and at 20,000 feet, it still made 1,625. The uprated engine sat under a redesigned cowling with individual ejector exhaust stacks, which turned the exhaust itself into a few extra miles an hour of thrust. The fighter's basic armament initially consisted of 2 fuselage-mounted 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannon carried in underwing gondolas. Later aircraft picked up a second pair of 20mm guns inside the wings. 4 20mm cannon put the Shiden in a different weight class from the Zero, and from most of what the Japanese Navy was flying at the time. Kawanishi pushed production hard, faster than anyone had a right to expect from a program the Navy had spent so long resisting. By the end of 1943, the Naruo plant had assembled 70 N1K2-J fighters, and the second factory at Himeji rolled out its first completed airplane soon after. Once units started flying it, though, the problem showed up fast. The Shiden's main landing gear would collapse on anything harder than a gentle landing, and although the designers tried to reinforce the shock struts, the attachment points themselves stayed weak. That made using the brakes dangerous, and pilots wouldn't touch them until they were nearly stopped anyway, which did nothing for the length of the landing roll. They were writing off airplanes on ordinary takeoffs and landings, and the Navy noticed. On top of all that, the Shiden had a nasty habit of snapping into a roll to the left with no warning at all. Pilots liked it anyway, almost without exception. Whatever its technical flaws, what the airplane did in combat more than made up for them. At the time, the Imperial Japanese Navy was scrambling for powerful interceptors. It needed a fighter that could go up against the American Grumman F-6F Hellcat, and there were more of those over the Pacific every month. Generally, the baseline N1K2-J was seen as a stopgap. It was something to hold the line until engineers finished the aircraft that was meant to be the real answer. That was the N1K2-J. The first production batches of the N1K2-J were rushed to the Navy's 201st Kokutai. Japanese naval air groups were called Kokutai, and this was the unit that first took the Shidens into combat, flying out of airfields on the Philippine island of Cebu. Conditions there were desperate. The group was short of spare parts, short of fuel, and short of mechanics who knew the airplane. The finicky Homare engines made all of it worse, and the gear and the brakes were still the gear and the brakes. It got to the point where pilots often chose to land on the dirt alongside the concrete runway because the aircraft stopped faster that way. Better that than running off the end of the runway. None of that stopped the fighter working. In spite of the logistical and technical nightmares, the Shiden was doing real damage, and Allied pilots learned quickly to treat it very differently from a Zero. In the spring of 1944, Japanese industry threw almost all of its resources into building the improved N1K2-J fighter, better known as the Shiden Kai. But work on its predecessor, the baseline N1K1, hadn't stopped either. That produced new versions of the aircraft built around what the war was actually asking it to do. On one version, engineers took out the 2 fuselage machine guns and put all 4 20mm cannon directly inside the wings, so the whole battery sat in one place. The next one got special hardpoints so it could carry a pair of 250-kilo bombs, one under each wing. Later came a dedicated fighter-bomber version, capable of carrying 4 of them at once. To free up capacity for the new Shidens, back in December 1943, the Navy ordered production of the older N1K, one Kyofu floatplane fighter stopped at the main plant. That came right after the 89th production aircraft rolled off the assembly line. Meanwhile, Shiden units started arriving in the Philippines in real numbers. In October 1944, an entire air group moved down from Formosa to the island of Luzon, bringing over 100 N1K2-Js with it. The Japanese pilots flew the airplane hard, and they flew it well. Before long, though, it stopped mattering how well they flew. What beat them wasn't the enemy, but the lack of spare parts. The aircraft that came back from those fights sat on the ground, and there was nothing left to put them right with. N1K2-J production had actually been tapering off for months by then. The Imperial Japanese Navy had thrown everything behind the more advanced model, the N1K2-J Shiden Kai. Kawanishi's own plants were tooling up for it, and so were the plants of industrial giants like Mitsubishi, along with a number of naval arsenals around the country. In the end, the main facility assembled 530 early production aircraft, and the second source plants built close to 500 more airframes between them by the spring of 1945. By then, the first Shiden was finished as a production type. Official development of the first Shiden variant was shut down in mid-1944, but engineers kept experimenting anyway. Late that year, they converted one airframe into a rocket-powered interceptor, heavily modifying the rear fuselage to fit a small solid fuel rocket in the tail. Then, over the winter, a few airframes were modified into dedicated ground attack fighters, with a centerline rack for a single 250-kilo bomb and 6 rockets under the wings. Neither of those attack variants ever saw combat. From here on, the real burden of the air war fell squarely on the new model. The N1K2-J Shiden Kai was a far better fighter than the airplane it replaced. The original Shiden was a good aircraft. The Shiden Kai was outstanding, and it is usually somewhere in the conversation for the best fighter Japan fielded in the Second World War, although plenty of people will argue just as hard for the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. It kept the Homar 21 for better and for worse, along with the basic wing design and the heavy firepower of the earlier variants. But despite looking similar on the outside, almost everything else about the Shiden Kai was new. Japanese designers focused hard on making it easier to mass produce. They simplified wherever they could, and they used materials the country could actually still get its hands on, with the American naval blockade tightening. The obvious change was the wing. It moved from the middle of the fuselage down to the bottom, which meant a shorter gear leg with no telescoping mechanism inside it, simpler and far stronger. The fuselage was redesigned from end to end and made slightly longer, and the vertical tail was new. Altogether, the changes took over 500 pounds out of the empty weight, and you could feel it in the way the airplane flew. By early summer of 1944, Kawanishi had 7 prototypes flying for final testing. Shortly after that, the first production Shiden Kais started coming off the assembly line at Naruo, ready to go to operational units. But once again, just as with the earlier N1K2-J, changes coming out of flight test were being worked into airframes already on the line in the middle of active production. That was chaos on the shop floor, and it cost them months. Deliveries of the new fighters fell badly behind schedule. Things only got worse when American B-29 superfortresses started working over Japanese industry. The Americans weren't hitting the Shiden Kai assembly lines directly, but they were leveling the factories that supplied the parts. Japanese industry couldn't get aluminum, couldn't get steel, and couldn't get finished engines or landing gear assemblies. The Shiden Kai lines kept running. They just kept running out of things to build with. Even so, the new N1K2-J fighters did make their way to operational Kokutai, slowly and in 1s and 2s, but never in the numbers anyone wanted. In actual air combat, even with an average pilot at the controls, the Shiden Kai could hold its own against virtually any Allied fighter. That included the P-51 Mustangs that started escorting the B-29s over Japan in the spring of 1945. There is one story that gets told about this airplane more than any other. In the version that has come down to us, the Japanese ace Kinsuke Muto, flying alone, ran into a formation of 12 United States Navy Hellcats. By the time it was over, 4 of them were down and the rest had broken off. Muto nursed his shot-up fighter back to his airfield at Yokosuka, where mechanics patched it together and put it right back into service. American loss records don't support any of it, and most historians now read the whole thing as wartime embellishment. It got told anyway, over and over, and it got told because of what pilots on both sides had come to believe the airplane could do. Overall, the N1K2-J excelled in dogfights at low and medium altitude. To get more out of the engine, engineers installed a water methanol injection system, which let them run more boost without detonation for a few minutes at a time. But there was a major catch. Above about 20,000 feet, the Homar fell off badly, and that made the Shiden Kai a poor high-altitude interceptor. Units did go up after the B-29s in it, but the climb took so long that there was often nothing left by the time they got there. As more and more inexperienced pilots began flying the Shiden Kai, a dedicated two-seat trainer became urgent. That meant a second seat behind the pilot and a second set of controls. The Japanese Navy's first Naval Air Technical Arsenal took on the project, and a handful of standard fighters were pulled off the line and converted. These received the new designation N1K2-J Shiden Kai Rensen. They put the second seat in behind the pilot and covered both cockpits with a single continuous canopy. The trainer kept its standard cannon armament, and on some aircraft they even added a pair of fuselage-mounted 7.7mm machine guns. Kawanishi never stopped working on the aircraft. The first serious follow-on was the N1K3J. The engine was moved about 6 inches forward to put the center of gravity where the designers wanted it, and firepower went up with 2 heavy 13.2mm machine guns mounted directly in the fuselage. However, this variant never saw mass production, and by that stage there was very little chance that anything new would. Workers at the Himeji aircraft plant only managed to finish 2 N1K3J prototypes. A carrier-based version, the N1K3A, was planned and then canceled. In late 1944, development began on the next variant, the N1K4J. Its main upgrade was the Homar 23, which made 2,000 horsepower on takeoff. In round numbers, that was what the earlier engine gave. What it brought was low-pressure fuel injection and much better manners high up, holding 1,570 horsepower up around 22,000 feet. Engineers built 2 land-based N1K4J prototypes and 1 carrier-based N1K4A version, and all of them completed their test flights. The B-29 problem still hadn't been solved. One of the first attempts to adapt the Shiden Kai to it was the N1K5J. It was fitted with a Mitsubishi engine designated the MK9i, a bigger displacement 18-cylinder radial. This power plant produced 2,200 horsepower on takeoff and held 1,800 horsepower at nearly 20,000 feet. Assembly of the first N1K5J prototypes was already wrapping up at the Himeji plant when, in June 1945, B-29s flattened the facility. The airplane built to stop them never got the chance. Even before that disaster, in the spring of the same year, Japanese military officials and industry leaders held a series of emergency meetings at Yokosuka. The answer, they decided, was the Homare 44. Thanks to an advanced supercharger, it was projected to produce 2,000 horsepower at sea level and 1,800 horsepower at over 26,000 feet. They planned to rush that variant straight into mass production. The Homar 44 never made it off the drawing board. By the time Japan surrendered, the primary manufacturer Kawanishi had built 351 production N1K2-J fighters at its Naruo plant. Another 42 aircraft came out of Himeji. The other manufacturers brought into the Shiden Kai program barely had time to get their assembly lines up and running. The Mitsubishi plant at Sarashima built just 10 N1K2-Js. Aichi and Showa completed only 1 airframe each. The Naval Air Arsenal at Hiro built 1. Omura built 10. Counting every airframe built, prototypes and experimental variants included, Kawanishi and its partners turned out 1,435 aircraft across the Shiden and Shiden Kai series. Set against the scale of the war being fought over the Pacific, those numbers were nowhere near enough. It was a genuinely great fighter, and that is the part worth holding on to. There were never many of them, and by the time there were any at all, it no longer made a difference. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you got something out of this one, a like genuinely helps the channel more than you would think. And if you are not subscribed yet, that is the surest way to make sure the next one actually finds you. I read the comments on every video, so if you fly, if you build, or if you have a source that says something different from what you heard here, put it down there. Corrections included, especially corrections. There is more coming on Japanese naval aviation. and on the aircraft that never got the production numbers they deserved. Until then, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.